Hello and welcome everyone. We're just going to give everybody a few more moments to join. While you're waiting, we ask that you fill out our poll question and tell us what your occupation is. All right, looks like our registration numbers are slowing down a little bit. So as folks are still coming in, I want to say well, not morning here, but good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Rachel Gibson, and I am one of the center directors here at the National Center for Victims of Crime. I work in our Center for Victim Service Professionals, providing training, technical assistance, support, and resources to providers and professionals just like yourselves. So I want to say thank you for coming today. We're delighted to have you. I see our chat box is going crazy with people telling us where they're from. I love that. Welcome, everyone. It looks like we've got folks from all over. So I am delighted to have you all here today. Just a few kind of housekeeping things we want to note. I'm going to say this a couple of times because I know somebody's going to miss it, but we are not able to give out certificates. We are planning for you all to hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you can hear me, that's great, but if I hear you, we're going to have to figure out what's going on. But this is a one-sided conversation, except that we do want you to be engaged and interact with us. So we had our polling question. If we can maybe get that up one more time for folks to still take if they want to do that, as well as if you have questions, we would love for you to post those in our Q&A box. And that's located at the very bottom of your screen. We ask that you don't put your questions in the chat because as you can see, the chat is in a flurry and I don't want to miss your questions. So if you could put those in the Q&A area, that would be best. Any other resources and materials that we have will be shared with you. You'll also get a copy of the recording today so you can share that with your networks as well. I want to introduce our distinguished guests today here. First, I'll introduce Liz Lowy, and she is co-founder and chief operating officer at EverSafe, a technology platform that monitors the financial health of older adults and families for fraud, identity theft, and age-related issues. Before coming to EverSafe, Liz was a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and oversaw that office's domestic violence unit before assisting in the creation of its first elder abuse prosecution unit, serving as the chief there for 18 years. We also have Sydney Palinkas, and she's community outreach and education manager at the Elder Safe Center, an award-winning program of Charles E. Smith Life Communities. Since joining the team in 2018, she's worked to build awareness around the issue of elder abuse through outreach, interactive trainings, and coalition building. Prior to her time at Elder Safe, she worked at the National Network to End Domestic Violence as the Transitional Housing and Positively Safe Coordinator. Thank you, Sydney. And last but certainly not least, my partner in this from Finra, Rob Mascio. He is the Director of Investor Education Outreach for the Finra Foundation. In this capacity, he cultivates and manages programs to protect consumers for investment frauds and other financial frauds. Mr. Mascio also facilitates Finra's Investor Issues Committee. Prior to joining Finra, he managed, or in this capacity, he was managing Finra's vulnerable adults and seniors team, including the Finra Securities Helpline for Seniors. Thanks, Rob. So we're gonna start our conversation today with really kind of diving into what is this topic we're talking about. So what is elder abuse? For those of us who may be unfamiliar, or for those of us who, especially when we think about state and court statutes being different in every jurisdiction, what do we mean when we say elder abuse? And why is this an important topic? Sydney, can you start us off with that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you all for joining. So when we're talking about elder abuse, we're really talking about a lot of different things. So that definition includes abuse that is physical, sexual, emotional abuse, financial abuse, neglect, and sometimes folks even include self-neglect in that definition as well. So it's really any mistreatment of an older adult. It could be abuse that happens out in the community, like in private homes between family members. It could be abuse that's happening in communities in a facility, right? Like an adult daycare center or in a nursing home. Abuse committed by professionals or family members. But most often, unfortunately, we are seeing this abuse committed by someone that the older adult knows and thought that they were able to trust. Right? About 89% of the folks that we see in our program are experiencing abuse by someone in their family, whether that's an adult child, grandchild, niece, nephew, or sometimes a spouse, right? Sometimes they've been in this relationship for 40, 50 years. And often they're experiencing multiple forms of abuse, right? Rarely is someone just experiencing physical or just experiencing emotional. And sometimes those will really escalate over time, right? It might have started as financial abuse. And then as the person gains more control over them, they might escalate to physical abuse or emotional abuse or even sexual abuse. And then we also see multiple perpetrators often. Right? So it could be mom who's experiencing abuse, not only from her husband, but also from her adult son who lives in the home. And sometimes it's a pretty complex family dynamic. So for instance, we had someone in our shelter program who was experiencing abuse from her son-in-law, and her son-in-law was also abusing his wife, right? So it's her daughter and herself are victims in the situation. And this affects so many people, right? The statistics show about 1 in 10 older adults are experiencing abuse. Just in the community, that number doesn't even include abuse that's happening in institutions or facilities. And I'm sure more numbers will come out, but right now the studies are showing that the numbers doubled during the pandemic. So one of the big studies that has been done showed 1 in 5 older adults reporting abuse during this time, which is really, really staggering. So I think 1 in 5 older adults self-reporting that they've experienced abuse. And we know that those reports are probably even lower than what they actually are. And people experience so many negative effects from this type of abuse. They're at 300% higher risk of early death. They're more likely to have depression. They're more likely to have really high healthcare costs and really, really significant financial losses. So I always say for the folks where this doesn't, grab your heartstrings, it's kind of touching all of us economically, right? Because folks are ending up really relying on social programs. And in terms of statutes, which is a really important point, every single state and jurisdiction really defines elder abuse differently. So you really want to check in with your own jurisdiction in terms of exactly how they're defining elder abuse. So for instance, in Maryland, our Adult Protective Services looks at people based on their vulnerability, not necessarily by their age. So just because someone is over 60 or over 65, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be in the Adult Protective Services jurisdiction. So you really want to check in with your specific state in order to check that out.
Awesome. Thanks, Sydney, for that. And I think that kind of gave us a really good foundation to guide our conversation today. As I think about what your definition of elder abuse, and you talked about some of those tactics, one of those tactics is fraud and financial fraud. And so I want to ask Liz and Rob, can you all talk about what this intersection means for older adults, and what exactly is financial fraud and exploitation in this context? And I'll start with Liz.
What is financial fraud in this context? I mean, it really could have a number of different ways that it manifests itself. It could be civil, it could be criminal, and it really also depends on the state and how the state defines it. But most important is getting in front of it and getting folks to recognize it. And there are a lot of challenges in doing that. So, those challenges are myriad. And I'm sure I see the folks who are out there, many of whom work with older people, know some of those challenges. But there's a lot of denial out there. And so even before we get to the question of how this is manifesting itself and whether this is appropriate for a possible civil cause of action or a criminal cause of action, we have to understand that there's a lot of denial going on. Wells Fargo did a study in the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, where they interviewed close to 800 older people and then adult children who were caregivers. And it was a really interesting study. I think it's called the Elder Needs Survey. I believe it's public and online out there. But that survey found that 98% of the older folks and adult children who were interviewed think that elder financial abuse is a problem. And that's what I'm focusing on here, is elder financial abuse. But 1 in 10 of the older people ever thought they could be a victim. So that's what we're up against. And so before we even, to your question, try to determine how this is manifesting itself, we really have to recognize that there's a lot of denial. Folks have to realize that this is a rampant problem, that it could happen to them, that it could happen to a family member, and that it's not always related to dementia. And I think that's why this is often sort of in the realm of denial within families.
I think that Liz, the point you made about it not always having a correlation with dementia is so important to keep in mind. I mean, there's so many reasons that individuals can become victimized by financial fraud, by financial exploitation, or just general abuse. And the position we're in coming out of the pandemic, a lot of individuals were isolated, and the Finra Foundation did a study with the Better Business Bureau. And one of the factors that we found that leads to individuals engaging in a potentially fraudulent opportunity, one of those components was isolation. And this is isolation, whether isolation in the traditional sense that we all kind of think about, that they were alone, they had nobody to talk to, they were cut off from other individuals. But it also included individuals that placed themselves in a position of isolation. So they might have been living with their grown children, or they might have had a network of individuals that they talk to, and socially they don't appear isolated, but they put themselves in a place of isolation by not talking to other individuals about what was going on in their lives, or not using other individuals as a sounding board. And through that study, we interviewed a few people who were victimized by financial frauds. And one person said, I had my daughter that I talked to frequently. I didn't want to bring this up for a couple of reasons. 1, I was embarrassed. And 2, I thought she was going to kind of push me away from it. And I thought this was something that I really wanted to engage in. So it's really important to remember that just because a person doesn't have dementia doesn't mean they're immune to any type of financial fraud or abuse. We did another study, the Finra Foundation did another study where we looked at profiles of what the profile that makes up specific financial fraud victims. And again, these are just general profiles. This isn't a hard and fast rule. But one of the really interesting components that came out was that when looking at individuals of investment related fraud, those individuals often were older males with higher levels of education, higher economic status. So again, that doesn't necessarily fit into that picture that a lot of people have in their minds of what a victim can look like. And it varies based on the different type of scam. Victimization profiles can vary a lot, but it's really important to keep that in mind.
I think you all brought up some good points. Rob, did you want to say something else?
I was just going to say, just kind of touching. So Sydney talked a little bit about the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, and the intersection between all of those and financial abuse. That's another component that it's really helpful to try and put those strings together. Mm-hmm. So there often is a bleed between those different types of abuses. And when you're looking at financial exploitation, and I have a definition of financial exploitation that I've pulled from a rule that Finra has. So Finra as an entity is a regulatory entity, a private not-for-profit regulatory agency tasked with regulating the brokerage industry and their employees. One of the ways we go about doing that is through writing rules. And back in 2018, we came out with a rule that essentially provides a safe harbor for brokerage firms to place a pause, a hold on the distribution of securities or funds. And they can do that when they believe that there is some sort of financial exploitation that is occurring. So the definition that we have, and again, this definition, it varies depending on where you're getting it from, but I think this kind of hits at the heart. So I just want to read this just to kind of level set. So for those of you that aren't necessarily sure how financial exploitation plays in, this is the definition that Finra has. So the wrongful or unauthorized taking, withholding, appropriation, or use of a specified adult's funds or securities, or any act or admission by a person, including through the use of a power of attorney, guardianship, or any other authority regarding a specified adult, to obtain control through deception, intimidation, or undue influence over this specified adult's money, assets, or property, or convert the specified adult's money, assets, or property. So I just wanted to throw that out just to kind of level set. So those that maybe fall more in the physical abuse area have an understanding of what financial exploitation could look like.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rob. And I think that brings up a good point, a conversation around, this sort of denial, but also understanding intersections of where communities are coming from. And we had a comment from someone working in Indian country, and they mentioned that the folks in that community actually may not view it as denial, but fear of being the cause of a grandchild or child being in trouble with federal prosecution. They didn't deny it was happening. They were afraid to report. Can you all talk a little bit about that kind of cultural community context?
I'm happy to share that. I think a lot of times, especially if it's a family member that's harming someone, going to the police or making that report can feel really scary, right? They might not only lose their loved one, but they might also lose their caregiver. They might lose their emotional support. They might lose their ties to the other family members. And I've also seen some levels of justification from other people, right? Well, we know she's taking his credit card, we know he's spending his money, but at least she's caring for him pretty well, right? And kind of justifying that financial abuse and kind of letting it go on a lot longer than normal. And, beyond just Indian country, I think there's a lot of communities that are really reluctant to report. Right. I've worked with someone right now, her son is financially exploiting her. He has been in and out of the criminal justice system his whole life. He's doing somewhat well right now, and making that report will really set him back, right? So she doesn't want to report because she knows reporting will be really detrimental for him. He's also a Black man living in America, so that's also a scary choice, right? To call the police on him. There's so many, complex layers, and I think for some people, when it comes to financial exploitation, it feels not as bad, right? Or not as serious as physical. So they let it go on a little bit longer than they might if it was a different form of abuse, at least in my experience.
Yeah, you don't have to be a member of an Indian community to be worried about reporting your son or daughter or other relative is stealing from you. There are folks, as was suggested in the comment, who are worried about being the one responsible for what happens next, although it's truly the family member that's responsible for what happens next. And a little note for any prosecutors out there, you know, threatening a victim who is defrauded by a family member that they might be, you know, held in contempt if they don't come in and cooperate is not a great idea, and does victimize them twice. And you really can work with them, assure them that you can try to keep them safe. And I found as a prosecutor, wearing my other hat, having them come in and explaining to the defendant, the offender, and the judge and the jury that they are required to be there. It wasn't their choice to come in. And in fact, you gave them a subpoena, will take some of the weight off them, and has worked a lot on cases involving not just financial abuse, but all kinds of abuse against a family member. So certainly the denial is there in a lot of cases, but also no one enjoys reporting their family member to the authorities. And that's even if they recognize that elder financial abuse is a crime sometimes if it involves a family member. Many people think it's different. Just like in the old days with domestic violence, they think, well, if it's in the family, if they're in the will, I'm entitled to it anyway, I'm getting it anyway, even if the testator hasn't passed away yet. So there are problems with reporting. Lifespan in Rochester, New York, spearheaded a great study, the elder abuse prevalence study, several years ago about reporting. They did a big survey of people, and that study found that only 1 in 44 cases of elder financial abuse is actually reported. That's mind-boggling that 43 out of 44 or not. And keep in mind that in that survey, they weren't talking to people who couldn't answer questions because of dementia or other cognitive challenges, but that made them a target for abuse. They had enough to be victimized, but not a part to take part in that study. So this is an underreported crime. It's underreported even by banks, investment firms, and credit unions because the statutes for reporting are different in every state. And I heard complaints as a prosecutor, and I do now, you know, in order to report suspected elder financial abuse, I have to check my state statute to see if it's mandated, if it's discretionary, who the protected party is. Is it someone over 60? Is it someone over 65? Is it someone with a vulnerability? And so we did develop with the National Adult Protective Services Association a great portal that is efficient, more secure than a fax machine, and quite secure, called Helpful, HELPVUL. That's a great reporting mechanism for financial services to get these cases reported. Because if I was going to talk about challenges, that would be challenge number 2, is getting these cases over to the right people. It may not be law enforcement. It could be a great aging organization. It could be APS. It could be Department for the Aging, or the many social services agencies out there, some of whom I've seen on this call, that can help.
Thanks, Liz. I think you bring up a great point talking about what are the challenges, you know, to helping folks get resolution, or thinking about what are the challenges to fighting these sorts of crime. Rob, I saw your mute come off, so I'll throw it over to you next, and then if others want to join in.
So I was just going to kind of just talk a little bit on what Sydney and Liz had said. This is not an easy topic. This is an extremely difficult topic for a myriad of different reasons. I mean, you have the underreporting, and the underreporting can happen for a whole different number of reasons, whether it's embarrassment, whether it's cognition, whether it's that justification that Sydney talked about, where, well, you know, this person is caring for me. If I report them, the one person I talk to is no longer going to talk to me anymore. Or, well, they're taking a little bit of money, but they're taking me to the doctor's appointment. So if I'm giving them $1,000 a week, then, you know, it's kind of like payment for driving me around, which we all know that $1,000 a week probably is not the same as a taxi cab or, you know, any of the other rideshare services. So it's such a difficult topic to grapple with. But one of the key takeaways, at least for me, is that notion of collaboration. So the more that we can talk about it amongst our communities, the more that we can, report to APS, report to law enforcement, report to Finra, report to the SEC, whatever agency it is, the more that we can report, the more that we can have a better line of communication between financial institutions, adult protective services, all the different parties that play a role, the better we'll be able to begin tackling some of the challenges that we have in the space.
Thanks, Rob. So it looks like we've got a flurry of questions happening in our Q&A area. So I'm going to pivot a little bit so we can make sure those get answered. I think I'll start in order of how they were received. So it can be a fine line between financial exploitation and sharing resources, particularly in families who typically pool assets, often true for families living in poverty. Do you have any recommendations for discriminating between the two?
What a great question. That's true. It can be a problem. But the truth is, there's a real difference between sharing assets, say sharing a bank account, which can be very dangerous because if it's a joint account, then you're both owners. And law enforcement may refuse to prosecute a case where someone is taking advantage of the fact that they're a joint owner. A power of attorney gives someone access to funds. So I'm a real believer in transparency. I hope we all are. And in a situation, you mentioned a situation involving poverty, but it also can involve situations that don't involve poverty. There's so many financial institutions that will recommend joint accounts, even if there's trouble, because that will relieve them of liability if there's more trouble. So I would say one of the most important things that a family can do is put together a team so that you can help each other keep an eye on things. Transparency is super important. Even if you're agreeing to share resources, there's nothing like transparency. And you can develop a strategy for having that transparency where it's not just two people, but perhaps a third person, whether it's another member of the family or a power of attorney or someone in your neighborhood if that's trustworthy, or a CPA or a lawyer. You may think of people that I'm not thinking of to form that team to keep an eye on things. I'm a big believer that technology can help here. I think we'll talk more about that. But honestly, sharing resources can be great as long as you have some transparency that goes beyond just one person. And I think involving a team is best. And of course, financial services could help with this as well. And we can talk more about what banks, firms, and credit unions could do to make this easier.
Thanks, Liz. And I think, Sydney, you wanted to chime in as well.
Yeah, I just, because Liz brought up joint accounts and thinking of how all of this is so connected, I just wanted to bring up how I have seen, a lot of different cases, and I'm sure we all have, where an older adult is scammed. The family kind of uses that as the excuse to then say, Mom, I don't think you can handle your finances anymore. You're having problems with your memory. I'm going to become a joint member on your bank account. And then that leads to further financial exploitation. And the scam is kind of the gateway, right, for other family members or trusted folks that should have been trusted to then exploit the older adult further.
Thanks, Sydney. We're going to go to our next question, which is, can you charge someone with elder financial abuse if the victim has passed away?
Yes, you can. I really love these questions, and I'm so glad we're doing this in a conversation. So thank you for that. And that's a question I get all the time. And if a prosecutor is telling you, no, you can't, then call me. I mean, we did it all the time in New York City. There's a famous case involving a woman named Brooke Astor. Now, you may think she doesn't apply to me because she had millions. And I would tell you, yes, she did have millions. But we had lots of cases where people died, and we investigated and prosecuted after they died and got convictions. And the Brooke Astor case, really, except for the amount of money, was it was really very similar to many of the cases that we ended up prosecuting. But sometimes you have to be a little creative, right? If the person's passed away, obviously they're not your witness at trial anymore. But what about a charge like conspiracy to steal from an estate? A conspiracy to steal from an estate might be a valid charge in your jurisdiction. And there are many charges that could be valid that don't require that you have a live victim who can take the stand and say, I didn't give permission. Because we're taking many of those cases right now where we don't have a victim, right? Many domestic violence cases, we prove without calling the victim. I know many of you know that. In fact, we try to build the case without the victim. People call it evidence-based prosecutions. I hate that term because all prosecutions are based on evidence. But we always try to prove a case without calling a victim if it's going to be traumatizing. And you can prove a financial abuse case without calling a victim too. And you can get a statement from a defendant if the victim is alive and has dementia, or even if they passed away. And sometimes that statement can be critical evidence at trial. So I see a lot of questions coming up about my local prosecutor won't listen to me. I saw one that said, I'm in a Hispanic community and they don't take us seriously. Don't take no for an answer. Try to put the case together. Call someone that's been successful at it. Try to reframe, call back your local law enforcement officer, prosecutor, ask for a supervisor, and get some more attention to it. Because sometimes prosecutors are afraid of cases that don't have a victim who can take the stand. And sometimes, I've got news for you, they're easier to prosecute. And I'm telling you the truth on this. As a former prosecutor who supervised an elder abuse unit, we did it all the time.
And don't be afraid to reach out to the financial institution, right? Having them at least notified of the potential abuse or that abuse has occurred could be enough for them to put a hold on the account, to lock down assets, or at least kind of facilitate that conversation between whoever's investigating or adult protective services or law enforcement, just to open that channel of communication.
Awesome. Thanks.
I mentioned Brooke Astor. She had died before the case went to trial. The trial took weeks. We called, 90-something witnesses. And I mentioned that case because it's out there online. And if you read about it, you can see it involved a power of attorney. The power of attorney was her son, for those of you who are writing about POAs. It was her son, and in the power of attorney, it said he could give gifts to others and to himself, right? And she died before the trial. Took the case to trial. Defense attorneys were chuckling that we wouldn't get a conviction. The jury gets these cases, and they convicted.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Liz. I think that gives us some real world context to this kind of conversation. We've got another question, and then I want to pivot a little bit because I think the next question we'll just need to spend some time on. But this next question is there a dollar limit that must be crossed before it's considered financial abuse or exploitation?
I feel like I'm talking to in some states, especially if it's a federal case, yes. In many states, especially if they're using common law, no. So, people would tell me in Manhattan, I didn't send it in because it wasn't, I looked up grand larceny. I looked up grand larceny 4 and grand larceny 3, and it wasn't enough it wasn't $1,000 or it wasn't $3,000. But you heard Rob give you a definition. I didn't hear anything about money in there. And the truth is, you can prove a theft case of a necklace that's near and dear to you that doesn't cost that much, or any trinket, because they're trinkets that are really dear to people that have no monetary value. And under the common law, that's theft. I believe in every state it's theft if you meet the other elements of the crime, no authorization to take, use, or possess it, and that sort of thing. So please don't be the police or the prosecutor. If it smells like theft, if a bell goes off in your head, call up your local law enforcement folks and ask them for 5 minutes to discuss what's going on. And by the way, if your case is turned down, ask them what they need in order for the case to be viewed as criminal.
Thanks, Liz. And just a reminder to everyone, I see flurry of comments happening in the chat. If you have questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A area because I'm trying to catch them all. And I don't want to miss anyone's question. And so I did want to kind of pivot and talk a little bit about mandated reporting. And this particular person, I believe, is from Maryland. So Sydney, you may have some insight here, but they were talking about mandated reporting on the part of financial institutions. In Maryland, banks make referrals to APS, but are not required to report to law enforcement directly. The problem is a referral for APS would only be opened for investigation if the victim is possibly vulnerable. An allegation is only referred to law enforcement if the person is deemed vulnerable. Can we talk a little bit more about what we mean by mandated reporting? Who's a mandated reporter, and what does it mean in the context of financial abuse and exploitation and fraud?
Sure. So that is one where it varies by every single state, just to make our lives more complicated. And in Maryland and other jurisdictions, financial institutions are mandated reporters. But again, the definitions not only change for who's a mandated reporter, but who we can report on. Right. So Maryland is not looking at age, they're looking at vulnerability, as the person said in their question. So they might be seeing exploitation of an older person, but that older person is not vulnerable, right? Therefore, Adult Protective Services might not be able to take that case. It could be a criminal case, but it could not necessarily be a case for Adult Protective Services, right? So when folks are reporting, you want to look at not only am I a mandated reporter or not, which doesn't mean you can't still report. It's just whether or not you have to report. And then is Adult Protective Services going to be the right avenue for me, right? Is Adult Protective Services going to be the person to protect this older adult, or might it be the police or the state's attorney's office? Liz, I don't know if you want to answer more in terms of.
Yeah, I don't, because I've been talking too much, but you're right. It's so complicated. And my company, Eversafe, EVERSAFE, has a chart out there. If you write Eversafe mandated reporting, and you can click on a state, you can see what Sydney's talking about with respect to reporting. It's so complicated. It says that if you meet the criteria and you work at a financial institution, you must report. You may report and hold. You heard Rob talking about the report and hold statute. And then there's a different criteria for any person, but you can click on any state there in the country for free. You don't have to give an email address like a lot of the folks out there do. We're not about that, but we use this for that reporting portal I told you about called Helpful, which, by the way, is live in about 5 states and more are coming. And it's live in every state. If you have a case involving mail fraud, the postal inspectors involved, they want to get the case via the Helpful form. But feel free to use that website. It's not just for financial abuse, to see, is this abuse something I have to report, or it's permissive, I may report it, or is there more in the criteria? Feel free to use it.
It really, I mean, as both Liz and Sydney said, it's so difficult because state from state, it is different, and it's widely different. There is one, so I'm trying to remember the exact date, the Senior Safe Act. I want to say it was 2019 that it was signed into law. What it does is it protects covered financial institutions and eligible employees from liability for reporting a case of potential exploitation. So this is kind of a blanket protection for financial institutions if they do report. So say there is some kind of some sort of action brought against them, they can leverage the Senior Safe Act as protection as long as they follow certain requirements. They have to have employees receive training and such like that. And so if any of the financial institutions are on the line, FINRA, NASA, and the SEC put out a Senior Safe Act training that is available out that helps kind of meet some of those requirements for availing yourselves to that immunity.
Thanks.
Maybe one of the only times they all agreed on something, right, Rob?
Well, it's for a great purpose, definitely.
And so I wanted to just pause a moment because I know we are using terminology and we want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Sydney, someone asked for you to define the term vulnerable.
Sure. So I have been talking mostly about how Maryland talks about vulnerability, But again, that's going to be different. And Maryland's definition is actually a little vague, frankly. So it's whether the person has a cognitive or physical disability that stops them from being able to meet their own daily needs. Right? Now, that is not necessarily a very specific definition. It's something you might be able to tell very obviously, or someone might be a little bit more in the gray area. So I would say if you are thinking about making a report and you're not sure if someone's vulnerable or not, make the report anyway. Answer the questions that Adult Protective Services has for you on that call. You might not be able to answer all of them, especially depending on your relationship with this person. But try as best as you can, answer those questions, and then let them really make that decision, whether they're vulnerable or not. And you might be able to ask them, right, are you not taking this because of the vulnerability? Often they'll tell you on the call if they don't sound like they would qualify, and then you can do your next step. But again, that's Maryland, so make sure you're checking out your own jurisdiction.
Awesome.
I can provide a definition as well from Finra. So again, going back to our rule, that 2165 rule, that report, or that ability to place a hold on transactions. That same rule defines specified adults. These are vulnerable people who may not be able to make their own financial decisions. A specified adult is defined as a person age 65 or older, or a person 18 or older who has a mental or physical impairment that impacts their ability to look after their own interests. So again, that's specific to our rule, but it provides some context. And again, as Sydney said, it varies from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Thanks for that. And I wanted to pivot into these next. I'm going to group these questions together because I think they're in the same sort of train of thought. So we've had a lot of folks asking about, if I am an older adult and I've entrusted someone, and in some of these scenarios, folks have been family members, other times they have not, but I've given my debit card for someone to get groceries, or I've entrusted someone with my money, or I may not have a cognitive disability, but I'm giving someone my information, and then those people then choose to misuse that access they have to me. Maybe they are taking money out. This particular one person said that they are using the debit card for things they're not authorized to do. What are some prevention strategies, or what are some ways in which those folks can be held accountable?
So I'm happy to talk about prevention, and then I don't know if you want to talk about how to hold them accountable. Is one thing we talk about, for especially if it's a home health aide, right, who might be using someone's debit card or credit card, is to have them pick up the groceries with just cash, right? Not have access to that debit card, never give them the PIN, only have someone who you trust, not someone who you're paying, be going through and helping you with your bills in that way. Really making sure you're not having your power of attorney also be your paid caregiver, right? Unfortunately, we have folks who don't have that safe family member who would be the perfect choice, and they do choose someone who is a paid caregiver or a home health aide, and that puts them at risk. We also see sometimes folks who are going through kind of like a friend of a friend to find that aid, right? As opposed to going through a licensed agency. And that can put them a little bit more at risk, because then they don't really have the person's record. There's nothing stopping that aid from exploiting one older adult and then moving on to the next, especially when we know how underreported these things are.
I'd also like to just point out, so the pandemic has caused a lot of tragedy, but it has seen a rise to a lot of potential solutions that can be used. I mean, just simply the rise of having groceries delivered or medications delivered. I mean, those are, they're simple, but it takes the role away from the person who could be abusing the individual, and has it delivered directly to them instead of, hey, here's my debit card, go to the grocery store and pick up this, and they stop by the ATM and withdraw money. I know Liz has other solutions, and technology really is a great thing, and we've seen a significant rise in the past couple of years.
It is. And so whoever asked that question about the debit card, we got cases like that so often in the Manhattan DA's office, and it can often be proved as a crime. And federal law prohibits the unauthorized use of these cards also. But I ask you this, put yourself in the shoes of a defense attorney, right? When you're referring the case, you know exactly what the exploiter is going to say. He or she is going to say, it's true, I used the debit card for groceries for a while, and then Mrs. Jones allowed me to use it to buy a few groceries for my family. And she allowed me to take out some cash for this or that. And, you know, we head towards trial. And the truth is, it's going to be one person's word against the other. So, and sometimes you can win those cases. You can. I mean, I had cases, it's the one for me, one for you syndrome, right? I had a case where an older victim said a caregiver could use it once to buy some food for her family. And then it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the caregiver actually got a car for her son. And you could see it. When you looked at the bank account statements, you could see what was happening. So technology really does help because you can share what's going on with that debit card and with other accounts through the use of technology, which is rather easy to use and which is really the reason why I switched over to prevention using technology. But again, setting up a system so that if you hire a caregiver, you have oversight of that caregiver and you talk to that older person every day about what they're doing is the best way of going about this. And frankly, I would never use a debit card to do this because they are much more, there's much more security if you use a credit card to do this than there is using a debit card. And that's why I tell people, those of you who are going to stores and putting in your PIN number with a debit card are making a big mistake. It can be more difficult to catch, and if you wait a while, it'll be far more difficult to get those transactions back after you figure out that someone's using it and they don't have authorization.
Thanks, Liz. A few short things. Liz, could you put in the chat box the web address you mentioned? I think it was helpful. We had a few questions about that. And then can you clarify your comment around banks and scams when you said NAPSA involved, you can get details from me? If you remember, that might have been early on.
We don't have a website for Helpful, HELPVUL. Why not? Because, and I think, Rob, you'll relate to this, we now have, I think, 27 financial institutions using it. They love it because they don't have to check each state statute to see, you know, am I mandated? Am I discretionary? You know, who's protected? But we have agreed not to make a website on Helpful because the financial institutions are paranoid about the information about how Helpful works being out there. So National Adult Protective Services Association is a partner. It started under a Department of Justice grant. SIPMA, the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, is a partner. And thankfully, Marion Gibson and Lisa Blyer, they run the senior investor initiatives over there, have really been helpful, HELPFUL, in getting financial institutions to join, investment firms to join. But if you call me, I can tell you about Helpful, and we can put you a list to get you started in your state, hopefully. We just added Florida. I hear there are some old people down there, and the FIs who are using it down there have really appreciated this way of getting cases over to APS. It's not just APS. If it involves securities, you can use Helpful to get the case to the securities regulator, or you can use it to get the case to the postal inspector. And I'm sorry about my voice, and I keep hemming. I try to mute it when I do, but I have a cold today, so apologies for that. But HELPVUL, feel free to contact me at Eversafe, and I can tell you about it, and we could put you on the list and do a demo for you on this portal.
Wonderful. Thanks, Liz. Rob, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so I've been looking over the comments, and there was one that I just really wanted to kind of touch on, where an individual said that a POA had moved $3 million of investment money into a bank the client was unaware of, kind of just generally asking, well, what can we do? The bank or the financial institution hasn't been fully responsive. There was a verbal notification of some sort of capacity issues. I would say that, so I know from Finra's perspective, we have brought cases when an individual had been listed as a POA and there weren't things that were done appropriately. I know other jurisdictions have as well. So I would say make sure you're reporting it. So to the extent that there is a brokerage firm involved, please do report it to FINRA. If it's something you can talk to law enforcement, it's something the district attorney's offices have taken action on. I know I'm thinking of one case that FINRA took, and it was a similar type of situation, and we were able to work with and provide information and a referral to the local authorities, who were then able to go after it from a criminal perspective. And again, just because you have power of attorney does not give you carte blanche to be able to use that funds for whatever you want. You know, you are a power of attorney for a specific reason, to act in the best interest of the individual holding that power of attorney for. And when that is broken, that is a problem. And Liz, I'm sure you've seen instances like that in your time as a prosecutor. So it's not something that is uncommon in a sense. And I think there definitely could be an action that could be brought, and I would elevate it to any financial institutions, to the regulators, to law enforcement, and continue to beat that drum.
Yeah.
Agree. How much better to get in front of it by having people aware that this is going on. You know, if the bank wants to argue this wasn't erratic or this wasn't suspicious, shut it down using your family team. You know, don't always rely on your bank or firm to get involved and shut it down, because they do what they can. I do believe they could do more, especially, you know, if they agree to work with fintech, but they could do more internally also. But it's really up to not just the financial institution, but to the folks here learning about this, and also to consumers and their loved ones, to develop a system to keep an eye on things. A lot is being missed. Most of the cases I got as a prosecutor, guess what? Do you think that the fraud cases were referred usually by a bank or a firm or a credit union? You might think that they were, but the answer is no. Well over half the time, they went on for a very long time and were finally discovered by a loved one or a friend or by the account holder, and they referred it to the police and to the DA. It wasn't the bank, or it wasn't the financial institution. Another good reason why families should develop a system for keeping an eye on things.
It really is, you know, a community effort. And I just, one other rule that FINRA put out, it's commonly referred to as our trusted contact rule. And so again, this is specific to brokerage firms. And what the rule does is it requires brokerage firms to make a reasonable effort to obtain a trusted contact on retail accounts. Now, it doesn't require that they get it, but they are required to at least make a reasonable effort to obtain that. So I bring that up to you all because, one, if you have a financial account, I would encourage you to put a trusted contact on the account. And if you're working with somebody who has a financial account, I would encourage them to put a trusted contact. And what a trusted contact is it's not somebody with power of attorney. It's not somebody who has transaction authority over the account. It's a emergency contact in a sense. So if that financial institution is seeing something odd going on within the account, they can reach out to that trusted contact to get some additional information. Or if the financial institution is unable to reach the client, they can leverage that trusted contact. But again, it is not a power of attorney. It is not somebody who can get the intimate details of the account. It really is kind of like that emergency contact person.
And I should just add that rule you mentioned is for broker dealers. I think there are banks out there that are considering having that similar kind of a trusted contact procedure on depository accounts. And I should also mention that that's what we do at my company, is we monitor all accounts, and we ask folks, we recommend that they designate not just a trusted contact, but we call them trusted advocates who can see transactions. And we recommend they have more than one. So it's not just one son or one daughter. You can involve 1 or 2 people or 5 people. It doesn't cost any extra. But again, get some visibility in there. You know, there are a lot of different accounts people have. It's not just a broker-dealer account, right? They may have another type of investment account without a broker-dealer. They may have a checking account or savings accounts and retirement accounts and credit cards. You know, there's a lot out there. You can use technology to look at all of it and make it easier. And I hope people are hearing that and considering advising people to do that. I do think we would be shutting down a lot of these cases.
Thank you, everyone. Good discussion. So we have a question here about, let me see, I just scrolled past it. What type of licensed agency would help with an older adult who is vulnerable and has no beneficiaries?
Sydney?
What exactly, like what type of support are they looking for?
I think, I just think they're looking for, if they don't have anyone to give their money to, when they pass, is there support for those sorts of folks, or what sort of steps this person can take if they have no beneficiaries, family, those sorts of things. And they may be also a vulnerable adult.
Yeah, I think, and Liz and Rob, you might have suggestions for this too. That's something we come across a lot, right? Where folks don't necessarily, it's less about that they don't have a beneficiary and more that they don't have that person to be the trusted person on their account, right? Sometimes they might have family and those family members are not folks that they would trust for that. Or maybe they trust them, but it's also going to be their beneficiary, right? And having someone manage your money who's also going to be getting it after you pass away can be definitely very tricky. We've seen folks who use other trusted people in their lives, specifically folks in their faith community for that. So not necessarily an organization, but they end up choosing their rabbi to be a power of attorney for finances, or the pastor of their church for the past 30 years. So someone in that capacity. There are, agencies who will help manage those things. I think it becomes really tricky when you have someone who also can afford that, right? Some of those companies can be expensive. There's different nonprofits that can help with that, but they're not universal, right? I can think of some in my own community that would help folks kind of manage some things, but those aren't necessarily universal.
I would say, one of the steps you can take is to, if they do have assets, talk to an estate planner, an estate attorney who can help set up, whether it's a charitable trust, whether it is some kind of mechanism to get the money to the place that individual wants it to go. And you set that up ahead of time. And an estate attorney or estate planner would be able to help with that.
There are also states that have professional fiduciary associations that you can look into. I've read about them. I don't think every state has them, but many of them do. And remember, there are aging organizations and APS and representative payees and other agencies that can provide daily money management that really, I know people think, oh, that's so expensive. Not always, but you do want to be careful and make sure that they're acting as a fiduciary, which means that they're acting on behalf of the principal. And, I've seen cases where close friends do it also. When someone has no one, if we're talking about someone has no one, so there's not only no beneficiary, but there's no family, there's no friends, then I usually try to get state aging or APS involved to see what they can do there. And there are folks like that, sadly.
Thank you, everyone. This next question is there any advice on how to best educate law enforcement responding to reports of exploitation from APS who states sound civil as possible responsible person or suspect has power of attorney and therefore allowed access to funds?
Okay, yeah, powers of attorney can be really helpful to people, but they can also be a huge problem. That might be, I saw them as a prosecutor. I see them now at EverSafe. We get calls every couple of days about POAs. I just want to let people know, joint accounts, they may be really helpful if the joint account holder is trustworthy. And so many times you can get visibility into an account, but remember, they're joint owners. You're not going to do well with a prosecutor's office if you have one. It's really important to explain to an older person or a younger person when they assign a power of attorney that agent or attorney in fact will have access to their funds. They should act as a fiduciary, but they don't always act as a fiduciary. So if there's a POA who is assigned, and there are different forms of POA, there's durable, which withstands incompetence, there's a springing, there are different kinds. You could read about them online, but do know that they have access to funds. They can take out the money. They can tell the bank it's for the principal, and maybe they're lying. Can they be prosecuted? To get to the question finally, yes, they can be prosecuted. I know assistant DAs, federal prosecutors, they're nervous about POA cases. They think they're civil. Personally, I think a power of attorney theft can be easier to prove than a regular old theft without a POA, because in the jury instructions, the judge can tell the jury, oh, you heard evidence about a power of attorney, and you go to a case, matter of Moglia. You need to evaluate whether that power of attorney was used in this case for the benefit of the principal or not. And that goes into whether there was a wrongful taking or a theft. So bottom line, they can be prosecuted. Sometimes they're more difficult, I'm not going to lie, especially if there's gift giving. But we have prosecuted POA cases where gift giving to the attorney, in fact, was in the document, in that instrument, and we have gotten convictions on those cases. So whatever you do, don't just give up. And if someone says, sorry, POA, that's civil, don't just give up. Listen to what I'm saying, read about the Brooke Astor case, and then go back again and let them know in a nice way, without being too aggressive, that it actually doesn't mean that the case isn't a crime if a POA is involved. I'm not saying you'll always be successful, but you might be successful on some cases.
That comment about often viewed as a civil matter, we see that as well as in investment-related frauds. And we, Finra Foundation, we have a training that we do for law enforcement. We do it with the National White Collar Crime Center, and it's a targeting investment fraud training. And the whole purpose of the training is to provide law enforcement, securities regulators, really any agency with the tools and the resources and the introduction to what investment fraud is, to kind of change that picture that, you know, it's not necessarily a civil case. It's not something that needs to be handled in civil court. There can actually be more of a criminal case out of these instances. So again, that's a targeting investment fraud training that we do with the National White Collar Crime Center.
Awesome. And I think that, Rob, you set this next question up because we've had a lot of folks asking, well, what can victims do? What recourse do they have? I know in a lot of cases, it's hard to get money back. So where can we start sending people to get help around this? I know one person asked, is there any sort of release of information template for victim service providers to kind of sign in the context of financial fraud, to loop in banks, financial institutions? Does verbal consent suffice? Someone else asked around this. It was one other around holding cell phone companies or companies that are a part of this. Is there a way to hold them accountable? And then where do we go to send family, friends, and victims to get help?
Wow, that's City, you want?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think the first big option is always adult protective services, right? Especially if you are a mandated reporter. Even if we have, folks who call our helpline or want other services, we always make sure that report has been made first, right? We want to make sure those folks are looped in and the person has that connection to their aging and disability services in their state if possible. There were so many questions in that question. But beyond that, I think connecting to your state's attorney's office is also a great resource. I think reminding folks that even if they can't necessarily get their money back, even if it's a financial scam that was online, there is still value in reporting. Right. I think that's maybe one of the many reasons that financial fraud is so underreported, that people think there's really no recourse. Right. And even if they're not necessarily able to get money back, there might be other safety measures put in place or that can be put in place so this doesn't happen to them again.
And there are a lot of different agencies that you can report to. So, for example, working with Rachel at NCVC, we put out an advocate's guide, and along with that advocate's guide, we have a checklist that runs through different types of investment-related frauds and gives action steps for individuals to take, places to report, agencies such as the FTC, if it's investment-related, the SEC or state regulator, Finra. There's a lot of different agencies that can be reported to. There's Better Business Bureau, there's AARP. And again, at the end of the day, as Cindy said, you might not be able to get the funds back for that client, but you can help the greater good. By reporting these type of instances, agencies are able to see a pattern. They're able to start working to take action and to shut down different types of frauds and scams. I know Liz has mentioned the postal inspector a couple of times. They've been really working hard and bringing forward a lot of really interesting cases. So then there's the FBI. If it's an internet related crime, you can report to IC3, which is the FBI's run internet complaint system. So there's a ton of places that you can report, and it doesn't hurt to report to all, right? Don't feel like, okay, I just reported to one, I'm good. It doesn't hurt to report to all. Over-reporting is not necessarily a bad thing.
I can't say enough good things about Finra's booklet with the NCVC. It's a really great booklet focused on fraud and where to go. So Rob, that's a really great resource that you just mentioned. Used to be provided for free to anyone who wanted it. And it's nice, it's paper, a lot of us like paper. The Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, also has a great website with lots of resources and help for victims of crime. So does the National Adult Protective Services Association, another site that's great for resources, as does the National Center on Elder Abuse. I could name more. And remember, don't give up on getting money back. Go to the financial institution and give them a hard time. My opinion is that financial institutions are defining what's authorized in a very limited way that I don't agree with, and a lot of folks don't agree with it when they're deciding who they're going to pay back. Is an older victim who is fooled into believing that the call they got is actually from the bank? Was that authorized if they transfer funds? Or is it really erratic activity for what's going on? Shouldn't they be looking at that? So don't be afraid to go directly to the financial institution to try to get restitution. And remember, your state may have something like Crime Victims Compensation Board. So you could go there. I've had people who have been paid back by their state's Crime Victim Compensation Board, and have your victims look at their insurance policy. Home insurance actually sometimes covers theft. I'm not saying it covers all theft, but we've seen some very broad language in insurance policies that did cover things like jewelry that was stolen and even money that was stolen. So have your victim take a look at that as well.
The other area that you could do is looking to see whether your state or your county has a multidisciplinary team of any capacity. I know a lot of states and a lot of counties are starting to put those in place, either an MDT or an EMDT or a FAST team that can really get the right people in the right room to be able to discuss certain types of cases. So I know I sit on a few multidisciplinary teams, and it's a really great model because it brings in the forensic accountant, it brings in prosecutors' offices, it brings in adult protective services, social workers who can all get together, brings in doctors, and they can say, well, this medication could be impacting this, and we're seeing this when we did a home site visit, law enforcement's knocking on the door. So it gets all the right people into the same room to really make a holistic determination on how to move forward with a specific case. And it's really, I'm a big proponent of that type of model. And I know, Liz, I know you as well. Manhattan was one of the first that really had a really strong MDT. I know California has a great program as well. So they are popping up all over. I saw somebody mention that there is one in their jurisdiction. So they are starting to come up more and more often. They're such a great model.
Yeah. The question, maybe we got off it a little bit, but Rachel, you had said people were asking about forms a victim could sign to, I guess, attest to the fact that they were crime victims. And I just wanted to say really quickly, wearing my former prosecutor hat, that can be a little dangerous sometimes. And by the way, what I said about state victims compensation board, someone said not in my state, not in every state, not in every insurance policy. These are just ideas for where to go. But I've seen folks trying to help in agencies like those that are on this call, having victims sign things. Remember, law enforcement and the prosecutor specifically has to look at the case if you think it might be a crime. And even a civil lawyer who's figuring out if it's undue influence, the whole theory of that civil or criminal case may be that the victim lacks capacity, right? And if your theory is, I saw something about a POA being forged. If you had a POA that was signed by a victim who had no idea what was going on, that's like a forgery, right? If they didn't understand it, that's part of your civil or criminal case. And if you guys trying to help have them sign a bunch of documents later in the game, or even have them, go revoke the power of attorney right away, a defense attorney is going to say, hey, these guys thought this person was competent. They had him sign 3 pages of forms to say that this transaction wasn't them, or that this POA, they're revoking it. You may be hurting the case. Hopefully I'm making this clear. If our theory is it's a theft from someone who's impaired, you don't want to have them sign forms right away before checking in with the police or prosecutor, because they may be arguing, yeah, you know what, that aging organization shouldn't have had them sign the form, because we're all arguing the victim is impaired. So bottom line, hopefully I'm making this clear. Before you have documents signed, if you do think theft or undue influence was going on, check in with the attorney or check in with the police or the prosecutor to see if that's the theory of the case, and then maybe slow down on having the form signed before you find out whether you might be doing something to compromise that case.
Thanks, Liz. I think that you really made it clear, and I think you gave some really good points around when we think about not only safety planning, but strategies, and what may feel like the right strategy could actually be a harmful strategy. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I appreciate that. Again, want to put a reminder out because I've seen it a couple of times. We're going to be giving this recording out. So if you have to hop off, don't worry, you'll get it. You'll also get a resource list. I'm gonna make sure we comb through the chat and as well as our Q&A and make sure that we have all of the resources listed, and we'll get that sent out to you with the recording in the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that, because I know tons of great resources were shared. So thank you for that. I did want to bring up a question someone asked around poly-victimization. What is the data there? Is there any data involving financial exploitation and physical abuse or sexual abuse in terms of what this means?
I specifically don't know about any data on that. I do know in our program, I don't think we've ever had someone who was only experiencing one form of abuse. Right, most of the time they are experiencing multiple forms of abuse. And I think from what we've seen, it might start as financial, and then those other forms of abuse are used to continue the control over the older adult. Right, they might be taking money, and then if the older adult starts to say, I don't want this to happen, right? Then they might start using physical abuse more. They might start using sexual abuse. And we've also definitely seen a pretty strong connection between financial abuse and neglect, right? So someone who's supposed to be providing care, bringing care into the home, does not do that, right? As a way to save that money. And then they are actually the financial beneficiary for this person. And we've had some actually very, very serious cases in Montgomery County in Maryland, where I am, where folks were finally found basically and were right to hospice by the point when they were found by the authorities. And it was financial abuse and neglect. So I don't have specific data. Liz, I don't know if you did.
Yeah, I probably do, but I wasn't expecting that one. I can tell you that there were hardly any cases where there wasn't more than one form of abuse happening at once, concurrently. And I think law enforcement and prosecutors really have to check for that. If you have an older victim who thinks someone is stealing from them, or someone finds out there's theft going on, you have to look for bruises, because all of the time we would find them later. The police hadn't looked and we'd find them later. Sometimes police did look. So there might be physical abuse as well as financial abuse. In many of our sex crimes cases involving older victims, and guess what, guys? There are plenty of sex crimes cases involving older victims. Jewelry was taken after the sex offense. So there you go. You've got your financial abuse and you've got your sex abuse and physical abuse. Neglect, often when there's a good deal of neglect, as you said, Sydney, there are other things going on, and if they're not going on right away, they might happen later. So look for the different forms of abuse. They're probably going on. Even if you have to charge it later, or even if you discover it later, your victim may be needing that kind of help and not just help for one form of abuse.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point, Liz. We've had definitely folks who they report the financial abuse first, and the rest of what's happening comes up much, much later. I think it feels, even with all the shame behind financial abuse, it still feels safer to report that than physical or sexual abuse. So those types of things might come up later, which is really important, especially for, first responders or law enforcement when they're having those conversations with folks, to really use all those same safety planning tools that they would use with another type of victim, and not think, oh, this is just financial abuse, right? Because there's likely a lot more going on beyond kind of under the surface there.
And someone mentioned emotional abuse. I just want to say you're so right. We tend to ignore emotional abuse and we shouldn't. Sorry, Rob.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say, Liz. It's, thinking about financial fraud, a lot of people, they automatically gravitate towards, well, there's a dollar a cost. That's the impact. That's the cost is the dollar amount. But Finra, we did a study that focused on some of those non-financial costs. And we found that 50% experienced severe stress. And again, this is to a severe level, or 44% experienced high levels of anxiety. Others experienced difficulty sleeping, depression. Now, these could then lead to different types of abuse. So while they might not be happening at the exact same time, that financial fraud, the emotional impact of that financial fraud could set them up on a track to be abused in some other capacity, whether it is to meet that emotional need or whatever it may be.
The University of Texas did research recently on the different forms of elder abuse and which form of elder abuse had the highest mortality rate or the lowest survival rate. And I think people out there might be surprised by the answer. You might think it's physical abuse or domestic violence. The highest mortality or lowest survival rate for all the forms of elder abuse was financial abuse. It was tied with neglect. So I say financial and neglect were the lowest survival rate, which I think people would find surprising. I am so sick of hearing people say it was just financial, or judges even suggest, it was just dollars. It's really serious, and victims die after they're financially exploited. Family members say they lose the will to live. I do think it's more than that, but I can't tell you the number of cases we couldn't go forward on because my assistant DA could never meet the victim. That was our policy. Even if the victim had, Alzheimer's type dementia, I wanted the ADA to go out and talk to them to see, who the victim was, not scare them, but talk to them. And many of them died shortly after they were exploited. So I know the folks on this call probably aren't that surprised by that, but others are. And I just think that's really important. And neglect can lead to death too. We had cases involving horrendous decubitus ulcers. Paige Ulrey is another prosecutor out in Washington that's had some of these cases, where victims got sepsis. We had a case in Manhattan where the children put a camera in the room, and this older woman who was still and had severe dementia had an ulcer. The caregiver was coming in and spraying Lysol on the wound. How painful that must have been. People die from ulcers and from sepsis, and all the types of elder abuse need to be investigated. You're right, there's probably poly-victimization, but law enforcement has to get good at looking for the different types that may be going on concurrently.
Such powerful statements. And again, really thinking about it goes beyond just the financial fraud. There's just so much, you know, that is going on in that victim's life that is interconnected, and it's all a part of that bigger understanding of what that abuse, that exploitation looks like. So thank you to our presenters, our esteemed colleagues for that. We're at the 10-minute mark. Wow, I thought we weren't going to have enough time, and I knew it, and we are almost at time. So I just want to conclude with one or two more questions. Let me see. This one was, can you address the need for a forensic accountant? I often see law enforcement and APS thinking that a forensic accountant is necessary and then dropping the case or investigation for lack of one.
Oh, Liz, you're muted.
Forensic accounting is very popular now. Folks have discovered it. It can be very powerful for those folks who are having trouble with law enforcement. You know, having the graph or the chart showing what's going on can really be helpful in getting the case accepted, and it can help juries. Forensic, by the way, just means pertaining to the courtroom. People get all freaked out by that word and think it's something really complicated. Forensic accounting usually means that you're creating an exhibit that can show what's going on with finances. You know, the victim used to behave this way, and now all of a sudden this account is dramatically, the withdrawals are dramatically increased, or the money's going to different places. So it's a great use of technology. And we do forensic accounting for folks at EverSafe, but I can't stress enough how important it is for people to be thinking about getting in front of the problem. Don't wait till there's a problem to ask an accountant to create a graph or a chart with forensic accounting. Get in front of the problem, use technology to identify erratic activity right away, and send those alerts to a team. I think the use of forensic accounting and technology, both of these things, are really important and kind of the new world for fighting elder financial abuse. It's fighting fire with fire. And I definitely think that juries and the judges like to see the charts in addition to the kind of boring testimony from the bank or the firm or the credit union about what happened and what it looked like before and what it looks like now. So I'm a big believer in forensic accounting, and I like the question.
Awesome. Another question came in. This person is a domestic violence legal advocate, and they've seen substantial increase in elder financial abuse correlating to an increase in drug use by adult children or grandchildren in our area. Is this something that you all are noticing with your organization?
Absolutely. Maybe the number one problem with cases involving family members are drug and alcohol problems. And the children or the so-called loved ones have this problem and are beating up older parents and stealing from them. I saw that, and I see it now, that is a really good point. And yes, I saw that 10 or 20 years ago, and I saw it when I ran the domestic violence unit as well.
Say ElderSafe, was about last year or 2020. I'm not sure exactly when it was now. Time is eluding me, but we did a webinar specifically on that topic, looking at the connection between the opioid epidemic and elder abuse. I mean, I can put that recording actually in the chat for folks.
Thank you, Sydney. Let me see. Let's get a good, another good one. This one is for Rob. Does Finra work with older adult victims' attorneys to help file a civil case against the power of attorney or the bank that permitted the power of attorney to take funds?
So Finra is not in a position to be able to help build a case. We can look at it from our regulatory standpoint, so whether it's a case that we would be able to pursue, but we would not be in a position to help a representing attorney develop their own specific case. But there are, trying to think what other potential resources might be out there. I would say though, case by case, if there is a specific case that you're looking at, I would encourage you to report it to us. You can report it through our complaint process, but we also have a securities helpline for seniors. And that is a toll-free number that anybody can call. It doesn't have to be a senior, doesn't have to necessarily even be relating to a senior. It can be somebody advocating on behalf of an individual. And it's a toll-free number staffed by live, knowledgeable individuals who can help provide resources, who can take information, who can further investigate allegations and concerns and complaints. They make a significant amount of referrals. So if it's something that falls outside of the jurisdiction of Finra, they would make referrals to the appropriate agencies. So it's a great number to write down, and I have it up here. So it's 844-574-3577. And again, I would encourage you to reach out to that number, have an advocate reach out, have the individual reach out, whoever it may be. They're in a position to be able to try and help you further. And again, a lot of these are case by case, so I can't necessarily speak blanketly on what we would and wouldn't be able to do. But again, I would encourage you to call that number.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. So in our last 4 minutes, I'm going to give you each a minute and 5 seconds or so to just leave me with your final thoughts. If you could leave our participants with one final takeaway, what would that be? I'll start with you, Liz.
Oh, final takeaway, get in front of the problem, consider using technology to do that, fight fire with fire. I'm a big believer in online banking, because if you and your clients don't have their accounts online, a scammer might get your account online. And don't just think that credit monitoring is a way to solve these problems. Most of the cases I saw as a prosecutor and now never landed in a credit report. You have to look at all financial accounts, checking, savings, investment, retirement, credit cards, credit data, which is in the credit report, and real estate, because there's a lot of home title fraud too, especially with seniors, changes in title, changes in liens, bad reverse mortgages, and have a team get in front of the problem. Because, banks and investment firms don't talk to each other. I used to think they did. I used to think my bank could call an investment firm if they saw something erratic in my banking activity. They are not authorized to communicate with each other. But you can have technology cover all of these accounts and communicate with people you designate, that important team, and get something in place, because this is a $37 billion problem, financial fraud is in this country, according to Bloomberg. I happen to think if it were affecting children, financial institutions would be more on top of it than they are, but you can help your older victims stay healthier financially. That's my takeaway.
Thanks, Liz. Rob?
Sure. So I'll kind of pull off the coattails of Liz. If you can get out in front of the problem before it happens, the better we'll all be. So one of the studies that we did with Better Business Bureau, we found that simply knowledge about different types of financial scams is a deterrent from individuals engaging. So in fact, people are 40% less likely to engage, 80% less likely to share personal financial information if they know about how scams work, if they know about what scams are out there. So the more that we can get out and talk about the potential scams, how exploitation happens, what it looks like, the better we can do on the front end. Now, it's not going to completely necessarily solve the problem. So when it does happen, we have to make sure that we're approaching the situation from a standpoint of compassion. So we're talking to these individuals. If it is a financial exploitation, you have to remember that emotional impact that they're experiencing. You have to remember the language that we're using. We are working on a study with AARP that's focusing on how we can change the narrative, taking lessons we've learned from other areas and apply them to financial exploitation and financial fraud, thinking about changing the narrative from, well, this individual was scammed, they were duped, they fell for this, to really putting the blame on the perpetrator, taking the blame away from the victim and putting it on the perpetrator, which is so powerful. And we think about the language that we use every day. And until we really started engaging in this project, even myself, I find myself gravitating, oh, the person fell for the scam. No, they didn't fall for it. They were a victim. And we need to make sure that we use that language in every conversation that we're having. Not only will it help with reporting, it can help with law enforcement's willingness to be able to move forward with some of these cases. There's a whole bunch of positive impact that this can have. And then remember to collaborate. So collaborate and report. Make sure you're reporting to any agency that you can, that you're collaborating as much as your agency is allowed to. From APS perspective, there are times where financial institutions place a hold on an account, and at some point that hold expires without sufficient evidence to continue that hold. APS can play a role by indicating to that financial institution that this is something that we're looking at. You don't even have to necessarily say we're actively pursuing. It can be something that's we're aware of this, we're looking into the matter, or you can authorize them and tell them, we'd like for you to continue holding the transaction. Just having that communication is enough to really help these individuals.
Thanks. And last but not least, Sydney.
All right. Well, I know we're already at 1:30, so I'll be quick. So just jumping off Rob there, thinking of that education, we want to make sure we're reaching everyone, right? And there's the folks that are at the senior center, and they're kind of the easy target to educate. But what about all those folks that aren't going to the senior center, right? That are really, really isolated. So trying to be creative in our outreach efforts to folks, and using that language, using language accessible services, right? How many folks are not getting this message simply because we're only putting out, English or Spanish flyers, right? Or the resources that we're giving out only allow reporting in that language. So we've been putting out flyers for meal delivery services, right? Trying to educate through the faith communities or through the local villages. So I think we really have to kind of look at who are really the most vulnerable and marginalized folks in our communities, and what are the ways that we can potentially reach them, right? Is it getting a flyer in the doctor's offices? Because we know at least they're going to the doctor, right? If they're going nowhere else, they're going to the doctor. And that could be the point of interception for that person. And it's going to be different in every single community. But I think the more kind of creative we are and looking at really how can we reach this most vulnerable person will help us reach more and more folks.
Wonderful. Well, on that great note, I know I enjoyed today. I hope you all enjoyed today. It looks like the chat was, again, just so much engagement. We've got tons of unanswered questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to get that sent over to our presenters as well, because we want to make sure you get your questions answered and follow-up information is shared. So on behalf of the National Center for Victims of Crime, we appreciate you all. Thank you so much. Be on the lookout. We'll also be releasing some new information for April around financial literacy. If you're not a part of our listserv, get on that, because we're hosting webinars almost every month. So you'll get tons of great information. Thank you to Liz, Rob, and Sydney for joining me on this journey today. We'll be in touch soon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Thanks, Rachel.
Take care, everybody.